Hello and welcome back to The Anecdotalist, episode 23, Spooktactular number 3, All Hallows Eve. I'm your host, Paul Packard, and with me as always, my co-host, Jason McKinney.
Hello.
We are here, our final October Spooktacular of the 2024 Halloween season. I'm happy to say we have somehow managed to produce one episode a week this entire month of October. We're wrapping up October Spooktacular tonight with the history and legends of Halloween. So, Jason, are you ready?
I am. I'm so sad that this is the last episode, but I enjoyed every episode, though. I will say that the last episode, I had some really funky dreams. I can't really remember them, but I just remember waking up the next morning thinking, oh my gosh, I am not going to re-listen to our podcast or that last episode that we did.
Yeah, it was a spooky one. That's just kind of how it goes. It is October. It is Halloween season. But what is nice is that I think this one's less scary. It's just the legends of Halloween. There are some monsters, and we do get into some sketchy Celtic mythology stuff here in a little bit. But I assume you should be able to sleep after this one. I had no issue writing it. Okay, here we go. The breakdown of the barriers between the physical world and the spiritual world, ushering in the dark half of the year. The Celts joined their druid priests in celebration and sacrifice. Monsters awoke and tried to kidnap those passing into the afterlife. If you are unlucky enough, you may be visited by one of these monsters, or worse, killed.
I would just like to say, why can't we be visited by a leprechaun that gives us a suitcase of money? Why is it always got to be a monster in the middle of the night? Why can it never be something good that we're visited by?
I don't think leprechauns, one, are good creatures. We can do episodes on that too. I think they're mischievous and devious and they do bad things. Two, I've never heard of a leprechaun giving anybody a suitcase of money. I don't think that's how it works.
Well, it's modern day. It used to be pots of gold. Now I just need it in cash.
Now it's Bitcoin. There's a hard drive at the end of the rainbow. I get what you're saying. If there has to be some kind of mythical, scary creature, you'd rather it be a small person with a pot of gold as opposed to something there to take your soul. I understand that. I guess I understand it. Okay, so All Hallows Eve. As Halloween draws near, I thought that what better way to wrap up October than to talk about the history and legends surrounding Halloween. To follow our normal structure, I want to first talk history. We'll give a timeline, discuss the beliefs and legends, and define how we celebrate Halloween today. We'll jump into some other classical Halloween legends, like Stingy Jack, and before wrapping up, we will talk about our own thoughts. So if we rewind the clock as far back as we can in regards to Halloween, we'll find ourselves in Celtic mythology, which I'm kind of sensing a theme here, just like how all roads lead to Rome. Kind of seems like all the legends and things that we've talked about up until this point, somehow we always end up back at the Celts.
I think that's kind of cool, though. I mean, the Celts are one of the oldest civilizations, right?
Well, when you talk about European civilizations, they are on the older side of those. We're not talking I guess Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt and things like that, which I'm sure there's plenty of mythology out there for those things. We should get into that. But since we are Midwesterners and a lot of us do descend from this part of the world, we have a lot of these traditions wrapped up in our holidays and things.
Which makes sense.
Yeah. The first thing we have to talk about is the festival Samhain, the ancient Celtic festival, which basically marked the end of summer and the beginning of the new year, specifically the harvest. So the Gaelic word Samhain translates to summer's end. Now, it wouldn't be a pagan ritual without spirits or talks of the veil between the living and the spirit world being temporarily torn so the evil creatures walk the earth. But although we do have that, we have much more. Just like in the Black Shuck episode, we talked about the wild hunt marking the dangers of winter. Similarly, the pagan ritual Samhain seemed to be a way to get everyone out to participate in the harvest.
So what was supposed to be like a good festival ended up turning into an evil festival?
No, I think it's more like a lot of old traditions have some type of like religious bend to them where ritualistically at some point it was understood that being out in the winter could kill you. So you have the wild hunt that keeps people from, or keeps kids or younger people or whoever roaming out by themselves in the winter. Similarly, I imagine that civilizations have been harvesting food at the same period at the same time through history, however long, and through that develops a festival and sacrifices and religious practices. It's not that it just becomes like scary or bad or evil. It's more that like we've been doing this for thousands of years, and now there's something tied to it, like a myth tied to it in some way. Which is with all human history, right? You have any kind of civilization that's lasted for a certain period of time. When they do things a certain way for however long, eventually there becomes some type of ritualistic religious aspect of it, if that makes sense. So in the early days, the Celts would ritualistically allow the hearth fires to burn out in their homes as they harvested crops. So this basically signified them not staying home long enough to keep the hearths on fire, to keep the fire going in their house. And so they were in the fields harvesting, however that worked, whatever. They were in the fields long enough to basically let the fire die. So ritualistically, the hearths would just burn out. Everyone would meet in the center of town. The druid priests would start this massive fire, and there was like this wheel with like with spokes and like flint that would cause a spark that would start a fire in the middle of town, and it was supposed to resemble the sun. Then everyone would harvest. They make some sacrifices. They would sacrifice livestock. They make this giant fire. People then would take that flame back home and relight their hearths. That's basically to signify the end of harvest, essentially. So now for the ancient Celts, this was a mandatory festival that lasted 3 days and 3 nights. Those who did not attend were said to suffer illness or death as punishment from their gods. Also, during this time, there was a ban on the use of weaponry, specifically calling out soldiers that fought in battles. Any crime committed or fights that took place were punishable by death. They would also drink a lot and eat a lot during this time, which the latter part is kind of like what we do today. In the fall, we drink a lot, eat a lot, watching football games, kind of similar.
We just took out the festival and replaced it with football. That way we could do it more often.
A different ritual.
10 years from now, we'll be going back in history saying some scary story, and this is what they did with football. Or 100 years from now, I should say.
Yeah. Yeah, in thousands of years, they will uncover the stadiums that we built, and they're like, these guys worshipped what was called football players. The Cincinnati Bengals. They worship their gods.
It's something called tailgating.
Yeah. So, like any pagan ritual, there are evil spirits and monsters that are associated with the Samhain festival. So, during this festival is when the spirit world and physical world was the closest. So much so, there was an overlap between the worlds. It was believed that during this period, the dead would cross over. It was also believed that evil spirits would roam the physical world, and doing so, they looked to kidnap ghosts of the living and keep them from crossing over into the afterlife, as well as terrorizing the living while they were at it. The living would then dress up as monsters themselves to scare off these spirits. They would also leave food out to appease the spirits. We'll come back to this because, like with all pagan holidays, eventually the Christians show up and they merge their own celebrations, and there's some confusion as to which tradition came from where. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there here a little bit later. But what I want to do now is I want to talk about these Samhain monsters. So the History Channel has a great write-up on all this stuff. I'll have that source in the show notes. But some of the deeper information, like the monsters we're about to talk about, come from older texts and books and compiled elsewhere. I'll again have a lot of these sources in the show notes.
How far back did you have to dig for this stuff?
It wasn't like how far back. It was more of how deep I had to go. Because for whatever reason, I don't know what it is. I mean, it's just the modern day internet. It's so hard to find things. But like I'd find an article that had a link, and then that link would fall, and I would have to dig, 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 and dig. And then one thing that was weird was this happened a couple times now where I'll find an article. So there's an article on the History Channel where they had written out a lot of stuff. Then I found a separate article. It was on this other website, and most of it was, I mean, it was all relatively the same, but then there was like 2 or 3 paragraphs that were copy and pasted over from History Channel. Like it was just like picked up and dropped in, which I don't know how often that happens. I imagine it happens a lot, but there was no credit to the History Channel on this other website. So it's just a matter of trying to dig deep. And then what I found was, so like, for example, the History Channel talks about a lot of these monsters, but it doesn't really talk about their history or where they come from. So, for example, the first monster we're talking about is the puka, which is a shapeshifter. And that's all the History Channel really said. So then I had to go and find information on what is a puka and what does it do. And then I went and found another like source talking about the puka. And a lot of these sources are referencing sources from like the early 1800s and like older texts and stuff. All that aside, all those sources are in the show notes. There's a bunch in there. Go ahead and dive in. There's a lot out there. I didn't buy a book for this one, which I typically buy books for every episode pretty much. But since we've been knocking these out so quickly, I just didn't have the time or the resources to do that. So this is all pretty much articles and things I pulled from the internet. So let's talk about the puka. So the puka was a shapeshifter, which could take the shape of some animals or even humans. In its unchanged form, the puka was a smaller imp-like creature, either all black or all white, and usually it was like hairy or furry. So we could get really deep into the etymology of this spirit, but it has places in many Northwest European cultures. But it all pretty much boils down to being a puke devil or a mischievous spirit. So, from my understanding, they weren't considered evil or mean, but mostly mischievous, tricking people into taking a ride on its back, which I think is kind of funny, where it would take you from like a terrifying journey, but then it would just take you back to where it picked you up and just drop you off unharmed. So, it would trick people like kids and stuff to get on its back, and then it would just take off, and they'd be on this like scary, terrifying journey, and then it would just drop them back off where it picked them up, and like they wouldn't actually be harmed. But they were said to be controlled by like sharp objects or spurs, and there's all these stories, and you can dive deep into this. We're not going to get into all of them, but there's stories of the puka tricking this kid into riding it, but the kid was wearing spurs, so the kid was able to control the puka. And so there's all these different types of stories where like sharp objects and spurs and things would keep it in check. And so in relation to Samhain, the puka was said to receive harvest offerings from the field. So essentially anything that fell to the ground while harvested, it was left there to appease this creature. Sometimes there was intentional piles of food left in the field just to give an offering to puka, called like a puka offering.
A puka offering. This sounds like a Pokemon. I wonder if this is where Pikachu came from.
I was thinking Puka Nakua, the football player, but it's actually interesting because when I was reading that, they whatever falls in the field they left. It reminds me of that old like Jewish law from the Torah where they would harvest food and anything that fell was to be left in the field so that the poor could come back through afterwards and pick up things off the ground. Ritualistically, that was almost like an offering of some way for the poor. But in this case, of course, it was an offering to this creature, the puka.
Interesting. You gotta wonder how much food just went wasted because of that.
I imagine animals and things came along and ate pretty much all of it. Or the puka was well fed.
I just imagine this little fat imp walking around
Yeah.
after this holiday.
Like a giant belly, just shape shifting into different animals and just like eating food. You know what? That's probably where it came from. That's probably why they said it was a shapeshifter, because they probably would like harvest the food and then look in the fields and there would be animals out there eating food and they'd be like, oh, look at all those pukas out there taking the shape of normal animals. And they're like, that's the puka. Ah, classic puka. So next, I want to talk about Lady Gwen. So, a lady dressed all in white and headless, accompanied by a black pig. Now, Lady Gwen would chase those off that were caught by themselves. If you were alone during Samhain, which I don't know why you would be, but if you were, you could have this unpleasant interaction of being chased by this headless lady and her pet pig. Now, A headless lady in white is described in many cultures, and there's all these different variations on her death: suicide, murder, the murder of her children, all these different things. The lady in white is kind of like a classic historical figure, which is kind of interesting, I thought. But Lady Gwen specifically is typically associated only with Samhain and the monsters that come out during the festival. Basically, just again, one of those things or one of those stories that are in place to say, hey, look, if you go out by yourself, you might get run down by this headless lady in white and her pig friend.
I don't understand. I'm so curious about the pet pig.
Yeah, I don't know. The pet pig thing is kind of weird to me. I don't know how that ties in, but it could, again, it could be like what we talked about with like the black shuck, right? Where there are wild pigs and there are wild dogs. I mean, if you have this myth or this creature that you've told stories about, these legends, and then you see a black pig running around, you're like, oh, that might be Lady Gwen's pig. I think that's just again one of those things where you have a legend or a story that you can tie it to some real world thing that people will see the real world thing and think, okay, this is part of that legend. This is part of that myth. And everyone then has their own story about how they came close to seeing Lady Gwen. Or, oh, I saw the puka in the field. It took the shape of a deer and it was eating food, or a rabbit and it was eating food from the field. It was being pleased. I think it's the same thing with the pig, right? Is that you have wild pigs out and about, so it's kind of easy to say you tie this mythical creature to something that everybody sees on a day-to-day basis, or in the day-to-day, that you can explain away as part of this legend.
That makes sense. Yeah, and also they're all drinking too, so I think that kind of helps with seeing your everyday ghosts.
Yeah, and they're all hammered, so that plays a role. It's funny. Okay, so another creature you could encounter during the festival is the slough or the slough. I'm not really sure how that's pronounced, but it basically means fairy host. So these spirits are spirits of the unforgiven. So they're considered to be one of the most evil creatures in Celtic folklore. Later, when it comes to Christianization of the pagan rituals, they would call these creatures or link them to the unbaptized children who died in childhood that would then come back and seek revenge on their family for not baptizing them, or possibly even fallen angels, which we know fallen angels to be demons. Either way, these fairy hosts would fight great battles in the sky. And to quote Anna Mazzala from the article The Slough, Spirits of the Unforgiven Dead, and this article again will be in the show notes. It's really good. You should give it a read. But I'm going to quote her quickly here. Quote, they took the form of gusts of wind, burning skin and causing boils. The hosts were winged like terrible, destructive birds. End quote.
Yeah, that's kind of creepy. I think this is the creature that I would not want to be visited by.
No, yeah, I don't think you would want to be visited by this either. And I don't know if it's more like you're being visited by these creatures as much as that they just see these creatures fighting in the sky, which reminds me of like all these old ancient stories, like the Iliad, right? When they sack Troy and they talk about the gods fighting in the sky above them while they were sacking Troy. And things like that, where there's all these old historical stories of while these great battles happened and these big historical events happened, things were happening in the sky above them. Like the spirit world was also in conflict at the same time. And it feels like that's what this is what this came off to me as, is that they believe that these are fallen angels battling in the sky, possibly during the Samhain festival, during this ritual that was happening above them. There was these battles that were taking place. Another part of this, though, is that these spirits were of the living and they would come back from the spirit world to steal and capture the souls of the living. So traditionally, it was said they flew in from the west. So villagers would board up the western portion of their house. So the windows on the west side, if there was doors on that side, they would make sure they were nice and secure and boarded up. Unfortunately, during the Samhain festival, the lines between the physical and spirit world were so blurred, they wouldn't just come from the west. They could come from pretty much anywhere. And so it was said that if you were alone you were at risk of having your soul stolen by the slew. And so, according to Mazzalo, more recently, these creatures were associated with Christianity and the evils of demons and things.
I feel like that's kind of mean to be saying that it was the souls of unbaptized babies, that they're like now demonized, like running in the sky, stealing souls and torturing people. Like now every like mother and father that didn't baptize their child back in the day, their kid dies randomly, and you're like, not only do they feel bad that their child died, but now they feel like they're going to be haunted by their spirit. Like that's just not right.
Yeah, but again, that's the point of these stories, right? That's the point of these like legends and myths is to scare people or scare children into performing daily rituals or the appropriate process that humans are supposed to make. I don't know how exactly to explain it, but like that's why in Catholicism you have babies being baptized because they try to do it quickly, not specifically because they're going to come back as slews now, but that's part of that, right? Is to scare people into performing the rituals that you want them to perform. And I think that's just the story. And that's why we read, that's why, you read certain stories to children that you can put in an easily digestible way, but scare the children from doing things that could potentially get them killed. Not that that's what I do or anything, but like that's just the idea behind some of these myths, is my assumption. I could be completely wrong and I could just be spitballing here, but that's what it feels to me like the story feels that way.
I mean, it makes sense. You don't want your kids running out at night, so why not tell them a scary story to make them definitely not run out at night?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so the last of these monsters, and probably one of the most well-known Halloween creatures we might think of today, is the Doulahan. So impish-like creatures, typically headless and usually on horses. The horses they rode on often had flaming eyes, and it was said if you had the unfortunate run-in with one, it was a death omen. We would know them today as the Headless Horseman. Doulahan translates to unseelie fairy, which then further translates to a dark or sullen person. Now, I found an article titled The Doulahan of Celtic Mythology on a website called The Irish Place by an author just known as Connor. Again, in the show notes, it's really interesting. Anyways, he goes into some detail on the Doulahan from Celtic mythology. So the Doulahan was said to be the soul of a man who lost his head in battle. So it's said that he rides around stuck on earth searching for his head. And so many others believe he rides around seeking out souls to take with him into the afterlife. So of the different variations, the one most prominent that we'll be talking about is the one where he's headless, but he has his head and he's seeking out souls to take with him. But there are variations and versions of this where it's just a normal guy that got his head cut off and now he's stuck looking for it. He rides around on a dark horse whose nostrils and hooves spew fire. In some variations, the eyes of the horse burn, and in others, he has no head at all. Depending on the variation, at least the one where he found his head and is seeking out souls, not the one where he's trying to find his head, it's said that he holds his head in the air as he rides, and his face has this like evil looking grin on it. His eyes are darting back and forth looking for victims to basically capture. And it's said that you can smell him as he approaches like dead, rotting flesh. So, to tie him into the Samhain festival, the Doulahan is said to be ruled over by Crom Dubh. He was an errand runner of the gods. He holds a whip that is made of human spine, and he rides around on an infernal horse. He's often compared to the Grim Reaper, as it was said by these ancient people that Crom would usher souls into the underworld in a large stagecoach. Sometimes it was like made of coffins or bones or whatever, but it was like this big stagecoach, and he was on his horse, of course. His connection to Samhain is that he is summoned to exact fury and punishment on those who do not follow the rules of Samhain.
Wow. So we got the Undertaker and the Headless Horseman. I like it.
Yeah. Well, the Headless Horseman, like the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, all that's based on this old Celtic mythology. As we'll talk about here in a second, a lot of the things that we do today are from old myths and traditions that then get merged with other things like Christianity, that then further get merged with secularism and modernism and things that we do today. And it's just kind of funny because this is one of those things. It was funny because I read one thing where it talked about how he had that whip that was made of the human spine, but he also had like a bowl of blood. And so like he would find a victim and he would either whip them in the face with the spine and like knock out their eyesight, or he would just throw the bowl of blood in their face and they couldn't see, which I don't know, it's worse getting whipped by a human spine or having like a bowl of blood just like poured on you. Probably the spine, but either way, you're being taken to the underworld. So I don't know. Again, this then fast forwards, and you have the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. You have the more modernization of all these things and the celebrations that we have.
Yeah, I do love the story of the Headless Horseman.
Yeah, well, if you enjoy it, it's based on that what we just talked about. So those were our monsters. And so what I want to do at this point is revisit what I said earlier about the merger of this pagan holiday and Christianity. Many Christian holidays we celebrate today have some kind of tradition in old pagan holidays. Think Christmas and the Christmas tree, which comes from evergreen branches decorating homes during the winter solstice, or Easter, which celebrated the spring equinox. Rabbits and eggs, both symbolizing fertility. Of course, the Christians celebrate the birth of Christ on Christmas and his death and resurrection on Easter. So, no different is Halloween, a pagan holiday celebrated in the West. And knowing the pagans really wouldn't stop celebrating this, we just kind of stick Christ on top of it, and it falls in line with Christianity. So, this was first done by Pope Boniface in the 5th century, attempting to move the holiday to May and celebrate saints and martyrs. The thing is that this didn't really stop the pagan celebrations that were already happening in the fall in October. So Pope Gregory in the 9th century declared November 1st All Saints Day and November 2nd All Souls Day, which basically just took Christianity and stuck it right on top of the pagan traditions that were already being celebrated.
Yeah, I think this is all really cool and very interesting. I love that we have pretty much learned like not only all the Halloween stories. It's pretty cool to learn that the Christianity was like trying to take over the holiday, and in a way, they almost made it even more Halloween.
Yeah, that's what's interesting about it is a lot of these pagan holidays. Think about it today. We celebrate Christmas with a Christmas tree, and then right next to the Christmas tree, we have a nativity scene. Literally just Jesus next to a pagan celebration. Easter. Our kids do Easter egg hunts. They get pictures with the Easter bunny. And then we celebrate Good Friday and the death and resurrection of Christ, which is funny because pagan and Christianity. It's really interesting, all this stuff. People don't really, I don't think, equate holidays or things with holidays in that way, or you don't really dig into it. You just know we've always done it this way. And it's really interesting to think that like a long time ago at some point they were like, okay, so we have this religion that is taking over the Western world. We already have all these other religious pagan traditions here. How do we get people that are celebrating these pagan traditions no matter what every single year to then celebrate Christ? And so they stick them together, and people then are doing these pagan traditions that now are Christian traditions, but not really Christian traditions. I think it's wild. I think it's a very interesting look back at like European history in the Western world. And I mean, how many times do we do things like that with anything?
The next thing you know is we're going to be coming up for the American holidays. So Independence Day and Martin Luther King Jr. Day. You'll be next.
Yeah. So back to All Saints Day. It was referred to as All Hallows, and the eve known as All Hallows Eve, which of course became known as Halloween. So the pagan tradition, along with the Christian ones, of course, they merged over time. Wearing costumes to ward off evil spirits merged with those who wore costumes of saints and angels who went door to door praying for the dead. And then they would receive cakes for their service. So the pagan tradition of leaving food out as offerings to spirits, and then also giving cakes to the door to door prayers merged together as well. And then we ended up with people dressing up, wearing costumes, knocking on doors, getting candy. So in some ways, it's difficult to tell apart what traditions are uniquely Christian or pagan. Did one influence the other, or did they have separate histories and just merge together over time? Can probably a little of both. So the question is, it becomes like, we know that people went door to door dressed in outfits of either saints or devils or whatever, knocking on doors and praying for the dead, praying for the souls of the dead. And then they would receive cake for that. So some historians, when they talk about these two different things that were happening, there's some merging that happens. It's so blended together that sometimes it's hard to tell, like, wait, so did they leave food out for spirits, or was that talked about later because they know of people knocking on doors and getting cakes, or vice versa, or the cakes being handed out to people knocking on doors praying because the people were already used to leaving food out. So that same kind of deal, they already leaving food out, they handed it to the people that were praying for them. And so it's like this weird, like, what came first? We're not really sure, but we do know that Christianity and paganism merged together here and created Halloween. And that's it. That's the history of All Hallows Eve, or Halloween. The Celts and the Christians, they merged together and created this tradition, which we still do today. I mean, my kids and I just tonight did a Halloween thing. So what I want to do now is talk about Stingy Jack and the reason that we have jack-o'-lanterns, why we carve pumpkins. Stingy Jack is where we get our jack-o'-lanterns, and it's said that he was a man of deceit and trickery. He performed many nefarious acts. However, even doing so, Stingy Jack, he sees this old man struggling, and he goes out and he helps this guy. And it turns out this old man was an angel in disguise. And this angel gives Jack 3 wishes. So Jack takes the opportunity to use his wishes, not for good, but of course for self gain. And it's to punish those who would sit in his chair, take wood from his tree, or touch his cobbling tools. And the angel is annoyed by this, and he condemns Jack. He's like, okay, you're forbidden. You can't go to heaven for the way you just acted. And so Jack's like, ah, crap. So some time passes, and the devil catches wind of Stingy Jack. He's known as this deceiver, and the devil is kind of jealous of this, and he's like, I'm gonna take on Jack. And so he decides he's gonna test him and try to take him to hell or whatever.
And now we have the song "The Devil Went Down to Georgia."
Yeah. Yeah, I actually thought that myself because it kind of has the same feel to it. And I wonder how much of that was influenced by this story, because similarly, the devil in this situation decides it's going to take Jack's soul back to hell. And so Jack is drunk, like was normal for him, I guess. And he's walking along the road and he sees this guy laying in the street. So he approaches the body of the guy laying in the street, and it's upturned, and he realizes it has this like evil grin on his face, and it's the devil himself. Jack is like, ah, crap. And so the time has come, I guess. It's time for the devil to take me to hell. So he asks the devil if he would do him a favor. And he's like, hey, will you grant me one last drink? And so the devil's like, yeah, sure, whatever. So they go to the pub, and Jack gets some beer. And he's like, thanks, Satan. Can you go ahead and pay the tab? So Satan's like, I don't have any money. And Jack's like, well, we got to pay this tab. He's like, well, why don't you turn yourself into a silver coin? I'll hand you over as payment. And when the bartender looks away, you become you again, and we get out of here and go to hell. And Satan's like, yeah, let's do this. And because he's thinking, oh, we're going to like do this one over on this bartender. So Satan turns himself into a silver coin. So then Jack takes the coin and he puts it in his pocket, the same pocket that has a crucifix in it. And the devil's stuck because the devil can't turn back into the devil because he's next to this crucifix. And so Jack basically makes a deal with him. He's like, I'll let you go back to being the devil, but you can't come back for my soul for another 10 years. And so the devil's like, ah, okay. So 10 years go by, and the devil shows back up. Same way as before, he's laying on the ground, and Jack walks up to him, and he's like, all right, I get it. You're back for me. You're coming to take my soul. He's like, man, I haven't eaten all day. Do you mind if I get something to eat? And the devil's like, I guess, sure, whatever. And he's like, there's an apple tree right there. And so the devil climbs this apple tree to get an apple for him. And while he's up there, Jack whips out his crucifix and puts it at the base of the tree. And the devil's like, ah, not again. This time, Jack's like, I'm going to ask you, you can never take my soul to hell. And the devil, being trapped, he just agrees to it.
Wow, I wish it was this easy to manipulate the devil.
Yeah, just the lesson of this story is to always carry a crucifix in your pocket for any like run-ins with the devil. Essentially, is what I've gathered. So eventually, Jack finally dies, and so he shows up at the gates of heaven, and Peter's like, "Nah, man, you can't come in here." So he goes to hell. Lucifer is like, "No, we had a deal. You can't come in here either." So then Jack is like, "Well, where do I go?" And he's like, the devil's like, "Well, you got to go back to Earth." And Jack's a ghost. Jack's dead at this point. And so the devil gives him an ember to light his way. And Jack puts the ember in a hollowed out turnip. And he walks around holding this turnip, this jack-o'-lantern, to basically see his way, to find his way. And so that's where the legend of jack-o'-lanterns come from. So pumpkin carving and putting a light in that pumpkin, a jack-o'-lantern is from this legend, this story of this guy Jack, who made an angel mad and lost his ability to go to heaven, who got one over on the devil and lost his ability to go to hell, and now is just stuck roaming the earth with a carved out turnip with a candle in it.
Oh my gosh. That was a great story. I like that a lot.
Yeah, it's a fun one, but it's part of those legends, right? It's part of the Halloween season, the legends. Everyone carves pumpkins. Everyone knocks on, well, kids knock on doors and get candy. It's fun to dig into this.
I do have to wonder, in the articles that you're reading, does it actually say that Peter says, "Nah, man, you can't come in here"?
No, that was me. I said that. Yeah. It's like how like there's new translations of the Bible. It seems like every year there's some kind of new translation that comes out. It's like that where I'm like reading this stuff, and it was like was it the Black Shuck episode? It's like the story of Strange and Terrible Wonder in the Black Shuck, where it was written in like an older English, and the lettering and all the words that were used are like some of the words we don't use today. It's kind of the same thing, right? Where I read these sources, and we're running a podcast here, so I got to give it the old Paul filter, and so that's what you get. I don't know what to tell you.
I mean, it's much more easier to read with your filter. I like if Peter just said, "No, brother, thou cannot come in here," I would not understand that. But Peter is like, "Nah, man, you can't come in here." Like I understand that so much better.
Yeah, you just got to give it that Midwestern Ohio tinge, and you'll understand it.
Paul has to do this filter for me. So sorry, all our listeners out there.
I got to give you the Midwest treatment. So, what are your plans for Halloween? I know this is such a weird, different episode because we're doing like a holiday episode. I feel like Star Wars right now. What do you have planned for Halloween? Anything fun?
I was thinking about maybe sitting on my couch and watching like a good Christian movie or something, or romance comedy, something that is completely unscary.
We've already done like 3 trunk or treats, and we got some more coming. And we actually have Halloween next week. Somehow, my daughter has worn 3 different costumes so far this Halloween. It's like a season. It's not even just Halloween anymore. It's like she's done multiple like walkthroughs with buckets and getting candy. And we have another one coming up, like a trunk or treat, and then we have actual trick or treat next week. It's like turned into this massive like 2 or 3 weeks worth of getting candy. Whereas when I was a kid, I wasn't even allowed to trick or treat, so I never even got any candy. And now my kids have 3 or 4 different outfits. They're doing outfit changes and doing multiple trick or treats, which is wild. But making it up for good old dad.
Are you going to take one of the buckets of candies and just pass it out during Halloween?
Actually, that's what we were just talking about. We have so much candy right now from doing all these trunk or treats. I don't think we have to buy. I mean, my kids can't eat that much candy. They're too little. They can have 1 or 2 pieces here and there, but that's what we talked about doing, was dumping all this candy they've collected over the last like 3 trunk or treats into our bucket for actual trick or treat. And our neighborhood gets a ton of kids, gets a ton of people. People like, it's one of those neighborhoods where people drive to the neighborhood from around the area and then walk our neighborhood just because of the way it's set up. And so we get a ton of kids, a ton of people, and I think the weather hopefully will be good this year. Last year it rained, but it looks like it's going to be good so far. Okay, well, we've kind of overstayed our welcome, I think, here. So let's go ahead and wrap this thing up. As always, thank you all for tuning in to another episode of The Anecdotalist. this episode wraps up our October Spooktacular. I'm going to say I'm happy to be on the other side of this, honestly. It's been tough trying to get one episode out each week. I've been doing so much researching and reading and writing, a lot of scary stuff lately. So I'm excited to get back to like a normal schedule and some not so scary stuff like a UFO encounter, which is our next episode. And so if you like our show, please remember to follow us, recommend the show to your friends and family, and please come back in 2 weeks for our normal schedule episode, which is about UFOs. So thanks again and happy Halloween.